Hi, folks. So we finally reached Lab 5, our first lab in this class where we start using the Rockwell automation tool, Arena, for discrete event system simulation. Now, because this is a new tool that requires a little bit more of an introduction, I think, for most students, because they probably have never seen it before, I'm going to split this lab lecture up into three parts. This first part is going to be a general introduction to Arena, where everything is in Arena, how to get started with Arena. The second part will be a step-by-step tutorial as we walk through building an arena model and all of those steps that are required to get anywhere from the blank canvas all the way up to the working model where we can analyze results. And then the third part will be the actual lab exercise, what's expected for you for this particular lab. Now, Arena has been around for many years, but they've recently had a major overhaul in their user interface so that older documentation, older textbooks, and so on do not look a lot like the current view, the current Arena 16.2 that are out there. Now, it can do, the current version does everything that the old version does. It doesn't actually do a lot of new things, but it has put things in very different locations. And so another reason for this first part of the lecture is to get everyone on the same page so that if you happen to be looking at resources that are referring to things that were in the old version of Arena, you'll know where to find them in this new version of Arena. So, with that in mind, let's get started. So, if you do happen to have the seventh edition of Simulation with Arena by Kelton et al., this has been updated for Arena 16.2. It matches all of the previous versions of this textbook, but all of the figures now actually show you the interface for the updated version of Arena. So that's great. This textbook will work great with the version of Arena that you can get directly from Rockwell right now. If you have older versions of the textbook, then the lab exercises that we'll do will still follow the flow of those older ones. But if they ask you to find a block in a particular place, it won't be in the same spot that those older textbooks will say it is. So you probably have to use this lecture as a translation tool to bring you back into this version 16.2. But I think once you get used to 16.2, it'll be very easy to do that translation on your own. So with that in mind, let's introduce 16.2, Arena version 16.2. Now, this is the way it looks. A major overhaul in Arena had to do with this ribbon that went up top here. It's a little more modern way of doing things. It has tabs that go across the top. Today, we're going to be focusing on the Home tab, and then most of the time spinning it on this Run tab down here. The project bar down the left-hand side is completely changed as well. In the past, there used to be context driven panels here where each panel had a mixture of these modules as well as data modules all in one, and you had to kind of think about under what context would you have to find things. Now they've kind of broken it down and they've sorted things into a way that is more generic. And it's actually is a little easier to find things now. But if you've gotten used to the old way of doing things, it can be a little frustrating. But once again, you get accustomed to where things are in 16.2, I think it's very easy to translate from the old 16.0 and before. So let's take a look at Arena. And this also applies to those of you who haven't seen Arena ever before. So then you don't have to worry about me talking about this, the older version, you can just build off of 16.2. Okay, so the big thing about Arena is this flowchart view. Arena is effectively a graphical programming language. You're going to create these process flows where your logic is captured in these graphical flowcharts, and you're going to draw these things in here. So you pull modules in from this project bar on the side, and then you wire them up together into this flowchart. So those modules, then down here in this project bar, those are the key things we have to know where those are, because that's really the syntax. That's really where we do our programming. It's where all the magic lives inside these modules. Once you drag a module on, and that's what you do, you don't click and then click, you click and then drag onto the flowchart. Once you do that, then you can use this connect tool, which is again under this home tab here, to then wire them up together. If you have auto connect, smart connect turned on, then you might find as you start dragging these modules in, you get these wires automatically populating. If you don't like that, you can click on the wires and hit delete, or click on the wires and right click and then go to delete. And if they're not wired up properly, then you click on this connect up here in the ribbon, and then you wire them together. And that's how you draw these diagrams out here. So most of the modules that you need are under this discrete processing. Notice that they're all color-coded. In this particular model here, most of these are green. All of these green ones come out of discrete processing. There's also these orange ones. They'll come out of decisions. And then there are these gray ones, which will come out of input-output. We're going to get to those in just a few slides. The other key thing here are the data definition modules. These are ones that are never dragged in. These data definition modules end up allowing you to configure the types of things that are running behind the scenes for these blocks here. So when you click on these data definition modules, then they update this spreadsheet view, which I'm going to introduce here in the next slide. But the basic idea here is you click on each one of these data definition modules, you're going to get a different spreadsheet view down here, which is going to allow you to configure those data definition modules. So you can add in attributes, you can add in entities, you can add in failures, and so on. These are all things that you'll be able to configure down here. We're going to walk through some of the key modules in each one of these in a few slides. And then, like I was just saying, we're going to see this spreadsheet view show up. And so not only does the spreadsheet view show up when you click on a data definition module, if you were to click on any of the modules, this gives you a quick access to the things that are configured within them. So if you were to double click on this create block, it would open up a dialog box that allows you to configure the create block. But also, if you were to just single click on it, then it will highlight it down here in the spreadsheet view. And then that allows you to actually configure it through the spreadsheet view as well. All right, so let's now look at specific modules that you will see as you start building your first models in Arena. And the ones you're always going to see, because entities are so critical to discrete event system simulation, are create and dispose. Create is a source of entities in these modules. So you drag the create block in. You can then adjust the timing of arrivals. So the inter-arrival durations, you can adjust how many arrivals happen, how many things arrive at each arrival event. Those are things that happen here inside the create block. Now, eventually those entities go through your system and have to go somewhere. And in the student version, you're limited to having 150 entities at any one time. So it's really important to get rid of them as quickly as possible. So you might have to simulate just small systems. But just in general, there's boundaries of your system, and eventually your entities become uninteresting to the research problem you're studying. So you got to get rid of them. And so that's why we have the dispose block. And so we pull that dispose block, and it acts as a sink for those entities leaving the model or leaving your model's boundaries. If we then look down here in the discrete processing, not only do we have create and dispose, but we need something that handles those entities once they're created and in the system. And the process block is the key thing that we're going to use for that. So the process block it's a tool that allows you to combine entities with resources to do activities. So the activity, that is the key thing that, we have an input model for how long a resource is being used by an entity when an entity needs that resource. That all happens inside a process block. Now, the process block, when you drill down into the process block, you can configure it to seize a certain number of resources, delay by how much time it takes to actually do the activity that needs those resources, and then release those resources once that activity is done. So when you start building these models, you usually configure process blocks to do all three of those things: seize, delay, release. And that is an option that you can set them for. Now, by default, a process block just does a delay. It doesn't seize any resources. So by default, a process block does not have this bar across the top of it. It only has this bar across the top of it if it has been configured to do a seize. A seize will grab resources for the activity, but if those resources are not available, then the entity that needs those resources to do the activity gets queued up, and it will then, during the sim, it will then show up on top of this little T-shaped thing in line, and you'll get to see all of the entities waiting for access to those limited resources in this queue here. But that only shows up here if you configure the process block for a seize. Now, in most of the first models you build in Arena, the seize, delay, and release you'll do all inside that single process block. Now, as you get into more advanced models, you'll find that maybe it is not possible for you to predict the exact delay time ahead of time, and it's necessary for you to separate out seize, delay, and release. And so Arena gives you the ability to do that by having separate seize, delay, and release blocks. And the seize block always has a queue across the top because by definition, if you're seizing a resource, there's an opportunity for that resource not to be available. So an entity that asks for a resource that's not available has to go into a queue. So that's how we get queues in Arena. We seize resources, and anytime you seize a resource, it generates a queue for entities to wait in when those resources aren't available. Okay. The other discrete processing blocks we have to worry about are assign. That's the one that we're going to focus on most here. The rest of these are a little more advanced. You'll get into them in more sophisticated models later. But assign is one that you use right out of the gate. So assign allows you to assign attributes to entities as they go through them. So when an entity goes through a particular part of the model, it allows you to stamp them with an attribute saying that they have gone through that particular model. They have been flagged for extra screening, and so the different logic has to apply to them later. Maybe they have been flagged for extra screening and they'll now go back through an earlier process, that the pre-screening process, and they'll now get prioritized to go through that because they've already been through screening once. So you can set up those priorities by assigning things. You can also assign global variables. So you can have a global state variable like a state variable and during an inventory management system for the actual inventory of the system. So as something, maybe as a customer goes through a particular point in the model and they deplete your inventory because they buy something from from those keeping the inventory, keeping the stock. If you want to decrease the stock, then your assign can subtract from that inventory. So the assign block allows you to interact with attributes that ride along with entities and global state variables. It's triggered by something passing through it. And then on that event, it either updates the attributes, adds the attributes, or updates the global state variables. So that's assign inside discrete processing. Now, another key block that is not under the discrete processing block, but is in our decisions block, is this decide block. Decide blocks allow us to, entities will go in and then they can go out different paths. So in the simplest case, it's just a two-way where they go either out the top path labeled true here or the bottom path labeled false. Now, in this simple two-way, you can configure that to either be by percentage. So maybe 75% of the time it goes out true and 25% false, or the other way around. Or you can set it up to be deterministic by a rule based on, let's say, an attribute. So if this has been if this entity has a particular attribute, they go out one side. If they don't have that attribute, they go out another. Or it could be based on the state of the system. So if the system is in a degraded state, maybe then they go out the true. If it's in a normal state, they go out the false. So you can set these up at probabilistic or deterministic rules. You can also set them up to have multiple outputs, more than two outputs. And so instead of just having a true output, it actually hangs off a line here, which will have as many outputs as you want. And then instead of having a false here, it will have an otherwise. And you can set up those multiple outputs to either be probabilistic, in which case it's kind of like a discrete random variable distribution. Which discrete output do you take? And you can set up a distribution of how often does you go out each one of those exits. And then the otherwise is whatever's left over. Or you can make them by rule, and which is kind of like an if then else, if then else, if then else, all the way down through that. And so if they match the first condition, they'll go out the first exit. Then if they match the second, if they don't, then they check for the second condition to go out the second exit, and so on and so forth. So that's what your decide block does. So this decisions panel holds a lot of things that allow for conditional routing or just kind of conditional changes in how entities are handled. And the decide one is the one you're going to use, early. Later on in the class, we're going to look at hold and signal, which allow you to do a lot of really interesting things. There are also these ones that relate to queues, like searching through a queue in order to decide which one to remove, if there's certain properties you're looking for, and so on. Those are more advanced and outside of the scope of a lot of things we do, but decide, yeah, you'll use very soon in this lab, even. The grouping panel is a nice one that it allows you to do batching among other things. And so, more advanced things like I really like match and batch. Those are really kind of some cool logic you can do there, pool-based logic and so on. That again is a little more advanced. But if you recall lab 2 in this class, we had a batching example about muffins arriving to an oven, and then they could only move into the oven when you made a decision that if we accumulated a big enough batch, and then that batch went into the oven. And then when they came out of the oven, then they got disassembled as individual muffins again. Well, you can do that in Arena with the batch module, which assembles a bunch of individual entities into one entity, where an attribute of that entity is basically how many entities are in that one super entity. And then later you can take the super entity in and then turn it into all the individual entities so you can separate them up again. Then under input and output, like the data definition modules, these things are not dragged into the flowchart. These things are just configured, well, except for the read, write, and the record. So these things up here are data modules that are not dragged into it. But, and I'm sorry that I spoke ahead of myself there. But these read, write, and record, these are blocks that get moved in, but their purpose is not to alter entities. Their purpose is to be triggered by entities to then write data out or read data in. So, for example, in the record module, which you use in this lab, an entity will go through and that triggers the calculation of a custom output statistic that then gets written into the memory of Arena so that when Arena finishes the simulation, it can then provide all of those things that were recorded into this record or record module. The read write module allows you to, in a more immediate sense, write directly to a file as the simulation is running. So you can get data that's being generated right in the sim. You don't have to wait for the report. Another interesting thing the read write module does is it allows you to read things in. And so, as an example, normally in your create block, you would say that we're going to set interrival durations drawn from a probability distribution. So their durations will be drawn from like an exponential distribution, but they'll be random. Now, you might have data on a real system with real interrival durations among real people arriving to that particular system. You can take that real data and use the real read write module to bring that into your system. And then in Arena, you can use those as your interrival times instead of drawing random interrival times. So that's another option there for your read write. And then going back to that data definition module at the top, this panel here, we've got a number of different configurable data modules here, like the ones that here are focused on entity. So this entity one here allows you to name your entities. So might say in this entity, we've got entities who are mobile orders or entities that are in-person orders. We've got entities that are people. We've got entities that are pets, and so on and so forth. So that allows us to configure those entities and then properties about them, like the picture that is displayed as they move around. There are more advanced features like the cost variables. So certain entities, when they wait in queues, they might accumulate different costs or costs at a higher rate. Like it's really costly to keep this type of entity waiting, but this other type of entity, we can actually keep them waiting for longer. It doesn't cost us as much, or we're not worried about it as much. So those sorts of things can be configured inside the entity module. So it gives us information about the entities. Now, the attributes, that's kind of changeable, programmable information about those entities. And so you can define the things that the attributes that you could stamp on each entity inside this attribute block and define their initial conditions. So you might define a priority tag on an entity. And so you say, okay, every entity by default has priority 1. And so maybe you've got queues that you always take the highest priority first. And so you tag everyone with priority 1. And then in the sim, then there are things that might cause that priority to increase. Well, you can then create in the attribute data module, you can create a priority attribute. And then that priority attribute, you can set an initial condition so that it's equal to 1, so that you don't have to bother manually setting it in your flow logic. It's just automatically set to 1. So that is one of the key things you do with this attribute module. I just want to note here that in this example, often when we name things, like when we name entities, we name attributes, we name resources, we prefix them with a letter that matches the type of thing it is. So we name attributes prefix with an A, entities prefix with an E, resources prefix with an R, and so on. That helps, it helps us read log files and error messages later. It also prevents name collisions. If we start naming things that have to do with similar processes, it sometimes you can accidentally try, name multiple things person. And so you're like, well, actually, no, this is a person attribute, and this is a person resource, and this is a person entity, and so on. So setting them up with a prefix that matches their type is not a bad thing to do, but it is not required. All right, so those are our two data modules to start with, entity and attributes. Another important one are the variables that don't write along with every entropy, or every entity, the global variables. And those are configured in the variable data module. So like I said, if you're creating an inventory management system, then the inventory, the stock, how much you've currently got in the inventory, that is a global state variable. And you probably keep track of that with a variable here that you could use an assign block to update as at different times. So you could add to the inventory and you could take away from the inventory. And so that variable and its initial conditions are stored or are accessed through this variable data definition module. The resource tab, this defines all of the types of resources, again, prefixed with an R in this case. And so these resources, these are the things that when you go into a process block or you go into a C's block, these are the things that in order to do an activity, you need to make sure that there are these resources that are available. These resources are all configured as having a fixed capacity of 1, which means that once you've used one of the prep A resources, then if it's currently being used, that 1, if another entity needs it, they have to wait in a queue. They can't get access to it. Now, you could make this capacity larger, like 5, and then 5 entities could use this at one time, but then the 6th would have to wait until one of those 5 release that. Or one entity need all 5, so you can seize multiple at once. Now, this capacity, you can also schedule it to change over time. And so defining how this capacity is fixed or stays the same. So you might find that you have more of these resources in the morning than in the afternoon. If they're person resources and staffing, those sorts of things, that's why you might want to change this. And then there are costing components as well. This is more advanced, but you can basically say certain resources, it costs so much for them to be idle, it costs so much for them to actually be doing work, and so on and so forth. And so if you've got a bunch of clerks sitting around not doing anything, then maybe you want to keep track of their idle time and actually say, like, how much are we paying them per hour for them to just sit there idle? There's also a queue module, which is related to this, because whatever the resources aren't available, then entities have to sit in a queue. And that queue module, if you click on that, that will actually show you the properties of any one of those little T-shaped queues that have shown up in your flowchart whenever you've set up a C's. So a process that's set up with a C's, or a C's block itself. Those will have queues. And there turns out there's other things that generate queues as well, like holds and so on, more advanced blocks. But any queue that's out there will show up here in this queue data definition module. And you can then define, is it a first in, first out queue? Is it a last in, first out queue? Is it a priority queue where we look for the lowest attribute? Is it a priority queue where we look for the highest attribute? Those are things that you can configure inside this queue data module. Okay. And then failures and schedules. I mentioned that you can schedule capacities to change throughout the day. You do that inside the schedule module. So you say this resource, there'll be more of them in the morning and less in the afternoon and so on. You can also do that with arrival rates. And so you can say we get more customers in the morning, less customers in the afternoon, more in the evening. So you can schedule changes in arrival rates. It knows how to do all that non-homogeneous Poisson process stuff. You just have to put in those and it will patch it all together for you. The other thing that's sort of related to scheduling are these failures. And so you can schedule, I don't want to say schedule, but you can set the duration between failures for any of your resources. So you can say this resource fails once every 30 days. And once it fails, on average, once every 30 days. So sometimes it'll be 25 days, sometimes it'll be 45 days, but there's a distribution. You can set up that distribution in this failure block here. And then you can also say how long it will be down. When it fails, it tends to be down on average for 10 days, on average for 2 days, and so on. So you can configure those failure durations, the distributions that go into that failures here. And then when you are back in that resource block, you can then define what failure schedule is tied to that particular resource. So that's what you do with those failures. Okay, now I've mentioned in a lot of these things the use of input models, activity durations, probabilistic durations. These are things that there are certain probability distributions like Expo that are already available actually under this delay type. They already have, I think, an exponential that's just there, but there's certain ones of those that are not easily available through in the dialogue, and you have to program them in using these expressions. And these expressions come from a language that's deep hidden within Arena called Siman. And if you know that language, then you can just type out these expressions. But if you need help figuring out those expressions, if you right click on any one of these expression lines, you can then go down to build expression and it will bring up the so-called expression builder. And the expression builder is great because it has all of these categories where you can go down through and you can find the thing that you're looking for. And it has human readable versions of all of those things that you could program in. And when you click on them, all of their attributes that you would normally have to type in this format here are again in human readable form where you can configure them here. And as you configure them, it will then populate the right syntax down here. And so you can put in one term of the expression, then hit plus or divide or whatever, and or, etc. You can create combinations of these where you are getting the syntax for all of these Siman expressions from this expression builder. So it's a great way to learn those expressions or to prevent yourself from having to learn them because you can always lead on this expression builder. All right, now I've talked about the template panels that come pre-built or come pre-stocked with Arena. Occasionally, you're going to need additional template panels. It might be because you need a more advanced feature that is only available in sort of a hidden template panel that Arena does give you access to. Or you might work at a place that's so sophisticated in their use of Arena that they've created their own custom template panels that you need to load up. If you right click on white space in the project bar, one of these panels here, you can go to template panel and then click attach. And that will bring up an attached template panel file explorer where you can select a folder. And I think by default, it takes you to the template folder in the Arena installation. And then from there, you can select one of these TPOs, template panels. And so these template panels, you're going to see template panels for the things that are already there, but you're also going to see template panels that you might end up needing, so like these blocks and elements, if you need to adjust your random number seed, for example, that's a more advanced feature that some people need, and you can get access to those through these template panels down here. So you've got some template panels that you're going to need to do the advanced features. Alternatively, if you want some of the old Arena template panels, you just like the way the old Arena looked better, you just like those old template panels, it was easier for you to find blocks in the old Arena. There's a folder, old Arena templates, that at least as of right now when I'm recording this, they still distribute with Arena, the old templates. You can go into that one, and then you can load the old template panels that old versions of Arena used. But be careful, because even if you use only those old template panels, if you save that DOE file, it still is only able to be opened in Arena 16.1 or 16.2 and higher. So even if you're only using the old panels, there's still underneath the scenes, that DOE file that you save out is still only available to open in newer files, newer versions of Arena. So once you start working in a new version of Arena, you can't really go back. All right. So we've talked about where to find things when you're building your models. So what about when you're running them? So if we move from the Home tab over to the Run tab in the ribbon, then we can see there's this Setup button here. When you click on that Setup, it's going to bring up Run Setup over here. And this Run Setup allows us to configure how our simulation's going to run. And the key things to look at here, at least when you get started out, is first this replication parameters. So this is where you define in your experiment how many replications you're going to run in the experiment, how long each one of the replications are, what your time units are, whether you're going to get rid of some of the data as a warm-up period to get rid of transients, etc. So that is all stored up here. If you have, as most people do now, multiple processors or multiple cores, the ability to run multiple threads in parallel, you can actually turn on this run replications in parallel. And then you can, if you need to run 10 replications and you have 10 threads that can be run in parallel, then effectively in the time of one replication, you get your whole sim done. So that's also down here. I would caution you to only turn this on if you absolutely know what you're doing. I would leave it off by default, at least when you're learning to use this, and without worrying about some of the other issues downstream that this creates if you turn that on. The other key area here is project parameters. So project parameters are stuff that doesn't matter as much, which is just sort of the documentation stuff up here, but the statistics collection. And so down here, these checkboxes, these define things that Arena knows how to calculate, but it won't calculate them and it won't record them by default unless you turn them on here. So you turn these things on, and then when you generate the report at the end of your simulation, then you'll be sure to get these data out and in that report. So make sure that you check these, because if you don't check them here, you're not going to get them. They won't show up in that report. So that's important there. I mentioned in the record block, you can define your own stuff that Arena will keep track of. But this is stuff that, this is like stuff about queues, like what is the average waiting time in a queue? What is the average waiting time for particular entity types, and so on? These are things that are kind of default things that you would expect any discrete event system simulation maybe might be interested in, and this turns them on and records them for you. All right, so you've configured everything through Run Setup. Now you'd like to run it. Well, under the Run tab, you've got this play, step, so you can step through your sim step by step by step, and there's an event calendar which you can turn on and take a look at and watch it actually go through that. I'm not going to go through that here. There's fast forward, which will crank the animation up as fast as possible. And if you want to kind of do have a more continuous control, there's a slider over here, allows you to slow the sim down and speed it up and keep that visualization on. If you just want the sim to run as fast as possible with no visualization, you can check on this batch run right here. It turns off the animation and it runs as fast as possible. This allows you to restart your sim. This allows you to stop your sim. When you run your sim, it doesn't automatically stop. It just leaves things where things have stopped at the end. So make sure that if you want to start editing again, you hit that stop first. And then there's this pause, and that allows you to actually pause the sim while it's running so that you can inspect that. And that's what we're going to see here in just a second. Now, after the sim is run, you can get reports on the data that was collected by clicking on the reports down here. And then there is a model settings or a model statistics that we'll see a little bit of here as I close this little tutorial here. All right, so while your sim is running, then if you hit pause, then you might see an animation get paused like this. So here I've got these two processes that both have a C's, so they both have Q's on top of them. These entities are displayed as colored dots. Some are blue and some are red based on, certain like whether they've been flagged for rescreening or something like that. So while things are paused, I can double click on one of these entities and that will bring up this entity summary. And it allows me to actually see the attributes that are loaded on each entity so that I can debug, does this really make sense to me? And that allows me to see not only the attributes that every entity has, like what picture they've got, their sequence number, and so on and so forth, their creation time, every entity has a creation time, and so on. But it also allows me to see the user-defined attributes that I've stamped on them. So this particular entity went through the assign part B sealer and arrive time assign block here, and it got assigned the arrive time and sealer time. These were drawn from a random distribution, and so I can see here what those random numbers were that got assigned back here and got stored on that one there. And I might want to make sure that, for example, if I flag this one for priority rescreening, that it was actually flagged for prioritization properly, so that this queue treats it properly, just as an example. So this allows me to pause and inspect a running simulation. Now, eventually that sim will end, it will complete. If I want to make it happen faster, I can hit this fast forward button and it'll like crank the animation up as fast as possible, or I click that batch run box and it turns off the animation and it's even faster. And at that point, it will pop up this box and I can say, yes, I want to see the results. Or if I happen to click no, I click on the reports and then I can click on model statistics. And that in the latest versions of Arena, in old versions of Arena, that brought up something called crystal reports. And it was an embedded way to view the data gathered through the simulation right within the Arena window. They got rid of that crystal reports. That was a licensed piece of software that they don't even include with Arena anymore. And instead, they have an Excel-based front end. And there's another alternative to this, which I'll talk about here in a second. But if you click yes, it's going to launch Microsoft Excel as long as you have it installed on your machine. And they highly recommend you do have it installed on your machine. Now, the Excel file that it creates doesn't actually have your data in it. Your data is stored in a database file that is also in the same folder as this Excel file. The Excel file needs to connect to the database file to then display your data. So when you first open that Excel file, it's not an XLSX file, it's an XLSM, M for macro file. So you're going to get this security warning most likely across the top here where it'll say some active content has been disabled. And then it's got this option to click enable content. If you don't click enable content, then across this entire Excel front end for your data, it's just going to look blank. There will be no data there. But the instant you click enable content, then you'll end up seeing all of your data pop up there and it will work fine. Now, I'm not going to go into detail here in the next part of this. Then I'll talk about, what all of these data are. The quick summary that I'll tell you right now is that in the project information tab, that's where you can make sure that you're running the right model and that you're looking at data, that it's not stale. Sometimes if you run your model over and over again, Excel doesn't catch up. And so you have to quit out of Excel and restart it in order for it to properly update. The cross-replication summary gives your stats that are aggregated across all of your replications, and all of these tabs over here show your data per replication. If you do start looking around at this and this cross-replication summary, it is a very, very wide sheet. So after you click enable content, make sure you grab this scroll bar and scroll way over, and you'll see that it has tons of data that is next to each other, like way over on the right. And so, whereas all of these per replication things, they separated out into sheets, all of the across replication they put on one sheet, and that's why it's so wide. So look out for that. Now, if you absolutely do not want to view your data in Excel, or it's just not working for you, in the same folder as your model file, you're going to find a .out file. So it'll be whatever your model's name is, .out. That out file is the SIMAN simulation summary file. And if you open that in a text editor, you will get most of the data that you can find in this Excel spreadsheet. And so that might be good enough for you. But for most people, I think they're probably going to want to navigate things here through this Excel front end. But just remember, enable content, because you have to run those macros to load the data. All right, almost done here. For more help, fortunately, there's a ton of embedded help and examples in Rockwell's Arena. So any dialogue that you pull up that you're not sure how it works. So I dropped a batch module on here. I double clicked on it, brought up this dialogue, and there's this little help down here. And any one of these dialogues, the help in the bottom right gives you dialogue specific help. So it doesn't give you general Arena help. Help gives you help just for this specific item that you brought up. And it'll bring up something that looks like this. So batch module, and each one of these are really nice. So like you go to examples, it'll give you multiple examples of how you could use a batch to do different things. Prompts, it'll tell you about each one of these. Each one of these are a prompt and why you might use different settings for each one of these prompts. Remarks, it tells you about warnings, how to use things properly, how to break things, and so on. So there's a lot of great stuff inside these help files here. So, you know, if you drop an item on here that you forget what it does, then use that help and you'll find very specific help. Now, if you do want generic help, that's available as well. Go back to that home tab in the ribbon, go to the far right and look over here. You've got Arena help. That'll bring up your generic help that you can search through. Release notes, if you want to learn about the latest version of Arena and how they differ from older versions. And then at this Arena product manual. So some really good stuff in here. If you just want to like a general getting started, click on this getting started with Arena. It's like a little mini book where you can kind of go through from the beginners to intermediate level and just go through and learn how to use Arena. There's text on OptQuest. OptQuest is a great tool that we see later in the class. It's a licensed tool that Arena uses. You can actually see in other simulation programs, other people license as well to do an automated search over parameters to do optimization, simulation optimization using Arena. There's variables and functions guide. So you just want to learn more about SIMAN and the different functions and so on, then all of that is kind of collected here. So, and then if you want to start, creating your own packages, your own template panels and so on. They've got that here too. So a lot of very useful stuff here under this home tab. And this is also my opportunity to show that you get the run stuff here. You don't get the batch run, but you get a quick access to the run controls and the slider here as well. So you can find that under the home tab. So a lot of help you can find. Almost done here. The last place you can go to learn about Arena are these pre-packaged working examples that Rockwell has provided. So next to the home tab, click on the file menu and it will open up this thing. Down here, on mine, it truncates them, but there's Browse Smarts, S-M-A-R-T, and Browse Examples. These smarts, when you click on that, there's all of these categories, a huge number of categories here. And under each category, there are specific examples. Notice all of these are DOE files. All of these are model files. These are small reusable examples meant to demonstrate how to accomplish basic but non-trivial tasks in Arena. And advanced topics, these are advanced topics, not just basic ones, but they're not meant to be a full system. They're meant to be like, how do I do this one specific thing that I need in my system? If you're always like, I just don't know how to do that. How do I do this batching thing or this control thing or whatever? Go over here and look down through these and you'll find a nice bite-sized example that just focuses on that little function. You might even be able to copy it into your model and make use of it. So those are the smarts. A great way to get started there. But maybe you do want to see a full example. Well, then go to Browse Examples, and you've got general packaging, tank flow. Each one of these has got a bunch of these fully working models, and these really are fully working, and they demonstrate everything. They demonstrate animation, they demonstrate 3D, they demonstrate a huge number of modules, very complex examples, wide range of applications from space travel to banking, to assembly lines, to harbor logistics, to elevators, a bunch of these. And again, I mentioned the animation. I don't do a lot of animation in the arena that I teach, but the ability for arena to animate these DES makes them really valuable to your stakeholders to really understand what's going on. And so definitely take a look at the way in which you can make use of animations there. And that's basically all I've got for you for this part of our intro to Arena. I hope that is helpful, especially if you're looking at a lot of resources for the old versions of Arena, and you know you need a create block, but you don't know where to find the create block now. Well, that's hopefully something that we've settled here. So with that, happy modeling, and I hope this has been a helpful tutorial.